Yeah. Okay, cool. So this is Stacks of Stacks. It is, as was said earlier, a talk that I've made specifically for this meetup. So it is exclusive content, but it's also under rehearsed content. So there will be some sort of asides and tangents and things like that, no doubt. The first one of which I should probably get covered is the fact that when we were sharing this, I think some people, perhaps they were being deliberately kind of silly, which made me laugh. They thought it was about stacks as in full stack or half stack or stacks of technologies, which is not what it's about. But I do have very strong opinions about that kind of stuff. Very controversial opinions, some people might say, about full stack development, especially, and all of that kind of thing. I won't cover those because it's about CSS, except to say one thing, because I am told that this talk can go on indefinitely because there's no timing. Just to say, perhaps it's an obvious thing to point out, but that full stack development, like the role, is bullshit. And when I say that kind of thing, if this was on Twitter, I suppose people would then jump in and they would say, that's really horrible of you to say that because I'm a full stack developer. Why are you attacking me? To be really clear, what I'm saying, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with full stack developers. And there's certainly nothing wrong with being interested simultaneously in CSS and in, say, APIs and MySQL, and other kinds of more back-end technologies. Lead a rich life where you take all of these things in and learn about all of these things. It's more that the role of full stack development has arisen as a result of the greed of capitalism. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take one person and give them all of the roles within a technical team so that you only have to pay one salary. And the pressure upon people to be full stack developers or be experts in every area of what is an enormous field is unfair. And so we've got to kind of, I think, whilst being interested in all of those things and being able to do all of those things, I still think it's reasonable to be able to expect to have a role where you're not asked to do them all the time. Anyway, so that's that out of the way, and now I'm going to move on to the more CSS related stuff. So the history of the stack, this is the stack component that I'm talking about. The history of it starts probably sometime in about 2010. And I was working, I've been freelance for a long time now, but I was working for some time at a small company in Norwich on a fairly meager salary. And I was the head of design, I think was my title, but I was hired because I was good at hacking MySpace pages. That was a long time before 2011. But so I was very much your kind of prototypical front-end developer. Before that was a term, I suppose. So I've been doing this for about 15 years or more. And it was a specific scenario where we were working on a Drupal site, and it was for a kind of cottage rental place. It was kind of pre-Uber type thing, where it was this organization where you could rent properties off them to go on holiday. I think Christian's in one now, although he's probably not by this company because I think they only did British properties. But in any case, there was this situation where in this company, we did have very separated roles. So we had our front end people, which was me, and the back end people, which was like 6 or 7 people who were very good at things like Python and Django and database administration and that kind of stuff. And Drupal is this funny thing, which I never really got on with. I have nightmares still about working with Drupal, especially this one, Drupal 6, because it was so slow in development mode. Just like refreshing a page to see if something had changed would take 30 seconds because I was on a Windows machine back then. I couldn't afford a MacBook, even if I wanted one. So it was kind of torturous experience. So I had to make a lot of try and kind of anticipate things and make simple decisions for myself. So I didn't have to keep going back in and changing things incrementally. And so I started to have to think, or I started to try and think about CSS in terms of algorithmically and anticipating context and trying to apply rules in such a way that it wasn't just change this individual component, move to this individual component, move to this individual component. And one thing that came up was that in the sidebar for this cottage website, which advertised properties or like highlight recommended content or whatever it was, I knew that there were going to be things in there that there were going to be I suppose in Drupal terms they're called modules, but I didn't know what those modules were going to be, so there was no way that I could actually apply margin to those modules to separate them, because those components weren't made yet. So I had to think of a way of doing it in regard to the context instead, and just say if there's anything in here, then style that. So that's how this sort of technique came about, whereby I used the universal selector and then the adjacent sibling combinator and then another universal selector. And it's just styling context in the sense that it's not styling an element by name, it's styling an element for where it is, or where it happens to appear at the time. And then I apply margin top to it. So every successive element, every element after another element gets margin on the top. And you may be familiar with that technique by now. I'm just trying to sort of like talk about the history of it, I guess. And this was called the Lobotomized Owl Selector for a while, because I felt that it looked like an owl's face, but an owl that was kind of catatonic or in some sort of brain dead state. And since then, I've started to just call it the owl selector, because as someone pointed out, and I think it is a fair point, that lobotomies are kind of a sensitive area. I don't think a lobotomy, I researched this a little bit again today, I don't think a legal lobotomy has been performed for the best part of 60 years in the UK or in the US, or probably in Germany or the Netherlands either. But there are still people who have family members who went through that, and it was a dangerous and crude procedure. So it's just owl selector now. It looks like an owl, lobotomized or otherwise. So there you have it. And the whole point of this owl thing, and it really does a very simple thing, is that it's trying to get rid of redundant margin. And I think of it in terms of like you're sticking things together. If you're sticking two things together, you're going to want to just put the glue between those things and not on the other sides, because then you're going to stick it to your hands, or you're just going to get glue everywhere. So it's all about being deliberate about where you actually apply your styles. And you do that via the context. You say only put margin where you are separating two things. And the main thing that actually solves is this problem where you have, say, a box component which has padding. If you were to put some elements inside it which just have arbitrary margin applied to them, then the margin joins up with the padding, and then you get this kind of additional space which you don't want. And that's a very, very small problem that solves, but sometimes it can be kind of powerful in a way, in that when you start using this concept around big sites where there's a lot of margin that needs to be managed, a lot of white space, it can really make your life a lot easier. And it's an example of, as I say, styling by context, which I think is not something that people talk enough about, really. It's something that I'm passionate about, because there's such an impetus, or the trend, I suppose, is to be very piecemeal about, right, you have your set of little ciphers, your class names, and you apply them to your different elements. It's always about styling individual things and not thinking about the system as a whole and how things interrelate. So I think it's really an interesting way of approaching CSS to do it that way. There are some less useful selectors like the awkward owl, which I don't really know what I'd use that for. And of course the Pinocchio owl there as well, which, kind of looks more like an owl, I guess, because it's kind of beak-like, but I can't think of anything that I would really use that for, except for when you actually replace the universal selectors with divs, because then you can do stuff like this, which gets interesting. Like I'm quite interested in the idea of using CSS as a like pure CSS for like unit tests and that kind of thing. And you can do like a visual regression here, where if someone's code is just nesting loads and loads of divs for no reason, then you can actually print a warning to the screen. In fact, I'm working on something at the moment in 11t where if I set up my node environment so that when I'm working in development mode, I have a number of the most of these kind of CSS tests are written for accessibility. So it'll be like image, not alt, and that kind of stuff. But then you can use your pseudo content and you can put, say, like a red outline around the element, and then you actually get a visual regression that way. And then, of course, when you're in production, you wouldn't include that style sheet. So like the partial in your handlebars or your nunchucks or whatever just wouldn't be included. So obviously with this kind of thing, when you try and do something as elegantly as possible, and I think the owl, which is just a star, a plus and a star, is about as simple and elegant a way of solving a problem in CSS, though I say to myself, you can get, because it's so small and simple. Obviously, people are then going to go, well, I would do it differently because I'm me. And they would come up with stuff like this. And I mean, first of all, yes, that would work. But the trouble is that it's more verbose to begin with. You've got two declarations there. Or you could do it this way, actually. You could use the use negation and have the pseudo class inside there. So then at least it's one declaration, but it's still more characters. But the main problem with this, and this is something which isn't talked about a great deal, and I didn't talk about it the first time that I went over the stack/owl selector stuff, is the fact that it's a specificity issue. It is verbose, but also you've got your class and your pseudo class there. So that's very specific. Whereas when you're using the owl selector, the star plus star, as much as that is a kind of a constructed or a non-trivial part of the selector because it involves two elements, has zero specificity because the universal selector is 0 and 0 plus 0 is 0. So what that means is that when you're actually thinking of, when you're writing CSS in, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but the traditional way, because this is the way that I like to do it, where you're harnessing the cascade. So you get a simple mechanism like this owl selector thing. You want to be able to include as high up as you can and be able to add exceptions in further down. So because the exception class is the same specificity as the more complex selector above it, and because it's further down in the cascade, then obviously you can easily just, you know, maybe it's a heading, so you want a bit more space above the heading, you can put that in there like that. So that's pretty cool. You can, of course, use recursion. So instead of using the child selector to localize it to like a parent component, you can just apply it to everything in the whole page, which when I first started talking about that, lots of angry people said, well, you've just blown up my entire design system, because this was published on a list apart and I assumed you knew what you were talking about. But obviously you have to be careful when you're doing that kind of thing, using two universal selectors without any qualification. But this is another thing which I find, and you may or may not be familiar with this or not, but I find people who come from a more sort of classical computer science background are really uncomfortable with this idea of exceptions, and kind of, because it feels like undoing something, like setting and unsetting and resetting a variable or something. And we do that a lot in CSS because CSS works like a filter system. And if we didn't do it, we'd end up doing this. So yes, you can add the odd exception in there. So maybe you'd have the owl selector and then you'd have underneath it, you'd say, okay, li, say maybe dt, dd, hidden elements. So the hidden attribute selector, there's a few things that you wouldn't want the owl to apply to. But if you're not doing that cascade way, then you are going to be positively and without using any exceptions, so that you might feel more comfortable with that, but you end up writing kind of this amount of code in order to achieve that. So that's not great, right? It's a lot of bloat. Some people I see have got really excited about using negations. So you end up with stuff like this everywhere. Again, there's a specificity, apart from the fact that it's quite ugly and unreadable. Again, there's a specificity issue in that the li and the dt and whatever the element is here will all be counted. So that will be specificity of 3, I think. So 1 for each element. So that again is going to, that means an element would not be able to override it in the cascade. So that's not great. You can do this. Now this is in CSS selectors level 4. And most browsers support it, but it took me by surprise the other day because I just got a Samsung Galaxy phone, and I haven't stopped using the Samsung internet browser, which is generally quite a good browser, I think. But that doesn't support that syntax, which is the level 4 syntax with comma separated selectors. So be wary that not everywhere, I think a few of the mobile browsers don't support that. So you would have to do not, etc. But you're not going to do that here anyway. So it's all good. So this being like me now being reluctantly familiar with modern development practices and components and modules and putting all of those things together, it's worth talking about how I now currently use this pattern, I suppose you could call it, or this kind of approach in design systems and in that kind of way of developing, or componentization, if you like, with apologies, because now you know that word, and that's not a real word, and it's also a very ugly word. So so you can do stuff like you could have a stack component, and then maybe you could have a stack small component which uses a small amount of margin, and you can nest those things, and it's all very modular. Everything in every layout, which Niels talked about earlier, is very modular. The idea is that you combine these basic primitives rather than having a monolithic framework. You just take these little ideas and you join them together. But the trouble with this approach is that you then keep spawning new components as you need them. So, okay, so we've got another component where we need to have an even larger gap. So we'll then have to create another class and all of this stuff. And there's this kind of will to power for all of these classes to be created all the time. And I guess generally speaking, we've got over that idea because we now use props. So we would have some sort of component, in this case in JSX, and we'd supply a prop, and we can put any value inside that string, inside that object. Worth noting here, and this may sound slightly bitter, but it is annoying to me that there was recently quite a lot of people in the React community were getting very excited about the idea of there not being, you shouldn't apply margins to components because, that component is in isolation and it shouldn't have its own margins because you don't know where it's going to appear. All of the sort of stuff that I was talking about in 2014. The idea for it, I guess I came up with before React, let alone React components using it. But in any case, they seem to think that they've invented the idea of stacks. It probably predated me. Somebody probably came up with the idea already. But this was the first instance I know of, I think, of there being a stack in a design system. I named it stack, and this is for Bulb Energy in the UK. And this is what we did. We had a space prop and we just did it like that. And it was one of the more successful things I did there. It wasn't entirely easy engagement. It was an accessibility engagement to begin with. But they discovered that it was kind of difficult to cover the CSS part as well, because everyone was a full stack developer. And the skill set was leaning much more towards the back end. But, that's the way these things go sometimes. Unfortunately, of course, this does involve JavaScript. So in order to have this mechanism where you're using a prop, which is very convenient, in this case, it's within the context of the environment, if you like, of React and of React components and JSX. So there's a JavaScript dependency on doing this. Now, if you're using JSX and you're using styled components and stuff anyway, that's not the end of the world. But it's not just about, if I'm using JavaScript, then I might as well use it for everything, because there are certain things which, even where JavaScript is necessary, you shouldn't use it for those things. So I guess what I'm saying is that, oh yeah, no, sorry, I should mention that yeah, so my relationship to JavaScript is that I write JavaScript every day, and I really enjoy writing JavaScript. And I think a lot of people think that I hate on JavaScript, or I'm a JavaScript hater or something like that. I don't actually hate JavaScript. I hate the fact that it's used in really terrible ways, and I hate the fact that the creator of JavaScript is a certified homophobe as well. So I go about and I tend to remind people of that fact. So if you go onto the briefs.video website, which is where my stupid videos are, you'll notice the script that powers the goat button, the button where you press it and a goat makes a noise, is written like this. So every variable is a reminder of the fact that the inventor of JavaScript is a homophobe. And it explains why it's not just a matter of opinion as well. So it says, const, it is not just an opinion we are talking about, const, he donated to proposition 8, const, it is true, that means stripping people of rights, etc. So the problem with this is that whilst I find that amusing, and you know, I'm here to entertain myself, now I've discovered that he's not only a homophobe, but he's also a COVID denier. So I'm now going to have to come up with another function for the Briefs video website, which explains the fact that he's a COVID denier in order to get that message in there. So that's some work that I'll have to write an issue on my own repository or whatever for doing that. Yeah, so CSS obviously has variables. I don't know if you've ever had this conversation where someone will say CSS isn't a real programming language because it doesn't have variables. And of course, they say that with confidence because they don't know CSS well enough to know that it does actually have variables, at least it does now. So which you reply, but it does have custom properties, to which they reply, what the fuck are custom properties? To which you reply, they're variables. So that needless conversation happens quite a lot. But what that does mean is we've got this opportunity, I suppose, to have that prop-like mechanism, which it seemed as if we'd have to depend on JavaScript to have. So yes, if you're already using JavaScript, you could do it like this. You could use a custom property and you could put that. It's kind of ugly syntax now, but you can supply it that way and then parse it however styled components parses that. But actually you can just do this on any element. And I think this is really neat because it cuts down the amount of code you write in your CSS, and also means that you can use this mechanism independent of what kind of stack you're using, whether you're using React or Vue or something more kind of static or progressive enhanced. And I use this a lot. And I talk about it a lot because I feel like other people aren't aware or they haven't tried it out. But I really suggest that you have a go at trying this kind of style, because what's great is that you have your stack component in your style sheet, and you don't have to obviously write out all of these big stack, small stack, smaller stack, smallest stack, or whatever, because you can simply provide the prop. That's why props are great. And it's reactive out of the box, if you like, because you put that in there and the CSS knows what to do with it. You're just setting that variable for this context, because custom properties work on a contextual basis, unlike, you know, your Sass variables and things like that. So I think that's a really nice pattern. Side note, actually, you should probably namespace it, because if you have another component which uses a space thing like a grid, then those things are going to kind of clash sometimes, where the space for the stack will start applying to the grid stuff. So maybe namespace it by the name of the component that you're using or something. There can be problems with it there, but it's a pretty good way of doing things, I think. And I talk about in every layout putting together a modular scale purely in CSS, which of course you can now do because we have custom properties. You don't have to write them out, just hard code them like that. You could actually use, say, the S1 and use the calc function to then do that. So just build them all from just a variable of whatever the ratio is, like 1.5 or something. And then, of course, when you've got those in place, you can start to restrict what gets put into the prop. So it's almost like having a way of typing the props. Now, we could get into CSS OM and all of it, like the actual real typing stuff and app property and things. But all I mean is that it stops people just putting an arbitrary value, or it encourages people not to put an arbitrary value into the as the space in the style property there, in the style attribute, I mean. Of course, if you abstract it further, you could put it all of these into JSON file, and we're sort of getting into design tokens territory. So that sort of thing I really love as well, because you can, by having it just in a format like JSON, you can use it to serve different stacks across a large organization. I ideologically think that design systems should not be technology specific. There's so many times where I've worked at a company where they've built this very complex design system in React with Storybook and stuff like that. And then when they want to build a static site, just like a marketing site, which doesn't need all of that reactivity and stuff, they have to use that stuff. So that then has to be in React. And it's kind of a bit of a disaster. This is great because I can have my super interactive desktop application like React thing on the one side, which uses this modular scale, and I can have my 11t static thing on the other side. So that's cool. And in 11t, it's really nice. And I talk about 11t a lot because to me, it's like people see it as a static site generator, but I think it's a lot more than that. I think it's just a way of, it's a really neat collection of helper functions for just generating stuff in Node, like generating content in Node. I use it to build both the everylayout.dev website, but also the everylayout.dev or the everylayout EPUB as well. That's actually done in 11t. So you kind of think of it as being just like a static site generator, but I'm using it to make books. You can use it to do all sorts of things because you can just bring in data, even async data, and just generate stuff. So yeah, it's a really flexible tool. But in this case, let's say we've got a website and there's a dedicated folder called data in 11t. And I can just have a JavaScript file in there called tokens.js, and that will be available everywhere in my application. So there's my tokens, and I can just use them wherever I like, which is kind of neat. So all I'm doing is just passing those tokens from the JSON and exporting that there. And another cool thing with 11t is that you can change the permalink for any file. And in the permalink, you can give it whatever file extension you want. So you can just have vars.css, and then suddenly this file, which has these interpolated values from my global tokens file, becomes a vars.css file. So that's a really nice way of incorporating my design tokens, which were abstracted into my JSON. And there are different ways of templating stuff in 11t. You can use JavaScript templates if you like. And if you're using JavaScript templates, you can do lots of really dynamic stuff. So instead of writing out all of those tokens one by one like this, I could do an object.entries, take the tokens and just map over them and write them out like that. And again, you can see different, it's a different syntax, obviously, because it's a JavaScript template, but you can see the data part at the top with permalink again. Obviously with because modular scale works on powers of a ratio. So number one on the modular scale would be, say, 1.5, and then number 2 would be 1.5 times 1.5, and 0.3 would be 1.5 times 1.5 times 1.5, and so on. Obviously much easier if you're able to do this just with math.pow. So that's like 1.5 to the 4th power, or whatever it's called in math. I can't really do math. So that's a lot easier. So you could adapt your thing so it just deals with your scale, and just have a scale file, and you can do array.from, and then you can just put in a dynamic length there. So if you wanted 500 points on your modular scale, you could just stick in 500 there. So you're much more flexible, and then again just generate the modular scale like that. So it's quite powerful stuff, I think, you can do with it. And then those can all obviously be applied to your stack component then. I should talk about gap, because recently, and it's exciting to me because it makes my life so much easier, the gap property, which previously was only supported on Grid, is now supported on Flexbox in all modern browsers. I say all modern browsers, all kind of mainstream evergreen browsers. So that's really good news. And so every layout, we did a second edition just in honor of it. And that's probably the only time you'll ever see a piece of design work by me which has color in it. I thought I'm really going to actually make it stand out this time. So I'll actually put some rainbow stuff in there. You've got a cat, you've got a dog, you've got a man with his head exploding, someone looking confused. Yeah, graphic design is my passion, I guess. And this was, it just so happened that we were doing this second edition during Pride Month. So in honor of that, we called it Gap Gay and Proud. Obviously, Gap stands for Gay and Proud. For some reason, when I was a kid, there was supposedly the clothing company Gap. It stood for Gay and Proud, and I think people said that like it was that was a bad thing, like, oh, they're secretly gay or something like that. But that's just great. I mean, if it did stand for that, I don't think it does, but anyway, so that was all merged in. So if you've already bought every layout, then you get all of that stuff for free. It's worth mentioning. So you just need to download the book again, and yeah, if you go to the authenticated website, you'll see all that stuff there. So yeah, supported pretty much everywhere. Some of the more esoteric mobile browsers don't have it. And the good thing about Gap is that you're applying, the real difference is that you're applying things from the parent and delegating it to the spaces between the children. So again, it's kind of, the Gap intrinsically is a way of styling things contextually. It's saying, put this thing between these things, and the between part is a dynamic thing because the between state might not exist. And that's really good because with a lot of components, when you start to nest them, where you're not doing this, you have to use, our hack to begin with in every layout was using intermediary wrappers, because to make sure that you didn't get margin on the outside of things, you had to apply a negative margin to kind of pull it to the edges of the container, and then put another wrapper around that to kind of insulate it, so that you could then have like a sensible margin for the component itself. And if that sounds kind of like, what are you talking about, Heydon? And that sounds complex and irritating. It is a bit, but now with Gap, you don't have to. So you can really easily just go from a grid layout to a stack layout, just using, say, like the orientation media query, and you'll only get those gaps between elements. But actually, with the stack component, we left it with margins because there's this interaction between gaps and margins where you can no longer do exceptions anymore. So the whole neat thing about the specificity stuff I was talking about before was that you could apply a different size margin to a specific element or a specific class of elements in that context. When gaps were already delegated, there's no way of doing that. If you're applying gaps to child elements, then they will be between every child element. They can't have different gaps. So actually for the stack element, it doesn't really work. And that's only really just to say that sometimes you don't, CSS isn't epochal. When Flexbox came along, you didn't have to get rid of all of the stuff that you've learned before. I think a lot of people think that Flexbox is or Grid is an alternative to CSS rather than a part of CSS, like a module in CSS. Oh, what's it called? Gaps here, so therefore we're not using Flexbox anymore. Flexbox has been deprecated. But yeah, in this case, margins actually made more sense. So you can use Gap with a stack-like element, but it's actually more suited to things like grids, where you really don't want different size gaps between things because they'd start to, look awkward and out of place. So that is everything I think I know to date, and I can share with you about the stack component and what I've done with it in recent years. It's been a bit of a weird journey because it was a sort of standout thing in my first ever conference talk, which was in 2014 or something like that. And it's something that just keeps coming back. Every so often someone will say, oh, yeah, I've been using this in my project. I just learned about it from this really fucking old article that some guy called Heydon wrote, or whatever, that. And it's, it's a funny thing because it's such a little thing really. And it feels as if it's a very sort of small achievement in a way that this has had some impact, but it just also goes to show how sort of organically these things grow and how they get taken over and other people improve them and that kind of thing. But yeah, so that's it. So I've got all sorts of, like Neil was saying at the beginning, I've got all sorts of projects on at the moment that I should probably mention before I shut up. I'm on Twitter. I always have a policy on Twitter. If you come into my DMs asking about something you don't know about accessibility or CSS, I will answer your DMs. If you just say hi, I will not reply. Or if you try and get me to be an unpaid tester on your new application that you've made, then I certainly won't reply, or I might tell you to fuck off. But yeah, any like genuine questions about accessibility or CSS layout, which seem to be the things which most people might come to me about, then I'm always up for chatting, because it always keeps my brain fresh about that stuff as well. And chances are, if you don't know the answer to it, I don't either, and we'll end up working it out together. So there's that. Mastodon as well I'm on, of course. Mutable Gallery, I create generative artworks with SVG. It's like a view application. You can create your own artwork, and then you can then print it, actually, because I've linked it up to an API with a company called Picho. The API is very slow at the moment, and I diagnosed the issue for them. So when you press like the buy button after you've created your artwork, because the idea is that you're dynamically creating an artwork which is unique to you, right? So it has to then do all of this on the fly. It's not coming from like a product inventory that already exists. It has to communicate with stuff, and it was slow, and I thought, well, yeah, it's going to be slow. But then I did some diagnostic tests, and I discovered that the reason it was slow is because for some reason, and I'm sure this is the case with loads of slow APIs and loads of slow websites. I mean, you've heard of Google Tag Manager, right? It was Google something or other, Google Ad Manager. It was hanging on that. And it was only a communication between this website where I'm desperately trying to sell art prints and this company that makes the prints and sends them to your front door. Somehow in the middle, they decided it would be a good idea to have some Google ad network thing happening. Like, there's no advertising happening here anyway. So it was probably just put there in by default. But anyway, that is the art stuff. The brief stop video, obviously, with all the anti-homophobia stuff in the JavaScript. But I do videos on there. They take a long time to make, but they go very quickly, so that you'll find that you might have to watch them 2 or 3 times to understand what I'm talking about, because I talk a lot of bollocks. I've just made a variable font. That was fun. If anyone wants to talk to me about variable fonts, because you're interested in making your own variable font, I'm always up for talking about that. And I've got a book called Bye Bye Billionaires. And the reason for that is that in my country, in the UK, which is supposed to be a free country, our government actually made it illegal for teachers to talk negatively about capitalism. So they lumped in anti-capitalism with things like terrorism and racism and stuff like that. So now children officially, it will be illegal to talk about Karl Marx in a British school, which is kind of scary. So I made a book, a children's book about capitalism and about how bad it is, so that kids could, parents could read it to their kids at home. So that's available as well. And yeah, that's everything, I think. So if anyone has any questions, then go ahead.